Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, starting out with some fighting in Robotyne, followed by fighting in Ukrainian. Then we have to go over the last 2 months of fighting throughout the offensive, as Syriac has made a recap over it. Then there's an article by the Wall Street Journal as well as by CNN talking about the offensive. And then I'll go and clarify the comment I made in a previous video about the 31 Abrams tanks. So starting out with the fighting in Robotyne. So for the fighting in Robotyne, the Ukrainian forces continuously attempt to land attack after attack in the direction of Robotyne itself, as well as in the direction of Verbove. So the main target in this part of the front line is to reach the first line of defense that goes through Verbove and down south of Robotyne. However, if they want to actually launch an attack on the first line of defense right by Verbove, they have to actually capture Robotyne, because Robotyne stands as an outpost for the Russian forces. As long as the Russian forces have the outpost here, they are able to strike the Ukrainian forces as they try to launch their offensive through the area northwest of Verbove. So essentially the Ukrainian forces are looking to gain control over Robotyne because it will allow them to then have a secure flank here to the south, which would allow them to then make their main push towards Verbove. And the reason they are targeting Verbove, it is because it is an area that is an intersection between the northern and the western part of this part of the front line. If we take a look at Tokmak, there are 3 roads that go towards it: the northern one, the western one, and the eastern one. And Verbove connects the northern one with the eastern one. If the Russian forces are pushed back from Verbove and the Ukrainians capture the area here, they are able to get a foothold across and make an attack from the northeast, combining that with a attack straight down south through the line of defense and through Robotyne. They will be attacking Tokmak from 2 directions. This is also why we see attacks through Lobkove towards Luhove and Vasilivka, because if the Ukrainians manage to attack from here as well, they'll have 3 directions at which they can attack in the direction of Tokmak. So the current Ukrainian objective and the role that Robotyne is playing in this part of the offensive is that unless the Ukrainians hold Robotyne, they will not launch their main push, because they would simply be unable to take advantage of that. They could use their main push to take Robotyne, but in that case they would be slowed down, and when they launch their main push, the most important part is that the main push actually hits the first line of defense. If they are spotted and properly fought against prior to hitting the first line of defense, the probability of them breaking through becomes much lower. So the Ukrainians will not launch their main push until they have captured Robotyne from the Russian forces. Then we move on to the fighting by Starmayovsky and Uroshaine as the Ukrainian forces started storming the village. So the Russian forces actually have some trenches here to the north of the village, as we can see in these pictures here, which showcases some of the fighting that has happened, or at least the aftermath. So we're seeing some Ukrainian soldiers dismounting a vehicle. We also see a lot of smokes coming from one of those vehicles. And then we see another one from a different perspective, which showcases some of these trenches. And we see another abandoned and disabled vehicle. Then we move on and see another one, which is a tank, and then another one, which is an infantry fighting vehicle stuck in one of these trenches. And all of this is located here to the north of the village, as the Russian forces seen through the satellite image here. We see the different trenches which are located here at the northern parts of the village, and this all showcases that the Ukrainians stormed the village, but it seems so far that the storming is unsuccessful, which is why Deep State Map is showing this as a gray zone, because it indicates that this storming has taken place, but if they manage to actually hold on to the territory or not is unclear, based on the imagery which we see here that showcases these equipment being abandoned and destroyed. Meanwhile, the Russian forces could easily have launched a counterattack, retaking these trenches, but at the same time, the Ukrainians could have launched a second wave, which would allow them to then recapture or capture the positions here to the north of the village of Uroshaine. And then there is this video here which showcases some Ukrainian BTR-4s, which are amphibious vehicles. So some tanks do swim, but essentially we do not know where this is. This could be here by Uroshaine, it could be somewhere else. Either way, it is the Ukrainians are either training or conducting some amphibious assault somewhere across the front. Then we move on to these images posted by Syriac Maps, which showcases the advances of the Ukrainian forces throughout these 2 months of fighting. So these images showcase the advances from June 4th to July 4th, as well as from July 4th to August 4th. So these are the advances throughout the front by the Ukrainian forces from June 4th to August 4th, the first 2 months of the offensive. We see throughout the front, we see that the Ukrainian forces have had generally more success in June rather than July everywhere on the front. And this is mostly due to the fact that the Russian forces are conducting some of their own offensive operations in the northern front. So according to Syriac Maps, this has a huge impact on the Ukrainian offensive due to the fact that as long as the Russians are active in the north, they need to send some reserves there to actually hold them back to prevent any Russian offensive in the north. And as such, they have less to commit in the southern front and by Bakhmut, which is why we are seeing the Ukrainian forces slow down, mostly in the southern front, but also partially in the Bakhmut area. So on top of the fact that the Ukrainian forces are fighting the Russians, where the Russians have the advantage both in firepower, but also that they are on the defensive and they have built these large amounts of defenses, they also have to focus on the Russians conducting their own offensive in the northern parts. Although it's not a major offensive, it is still some limited offensive pushes in the northern parts, which now has captured somewhere around 30 square kilometers in the northern parts of the Kharkiv region. The dangers of a Russian offensive is playing a huge part in the decision making of the Ukrainian forces. We then move on to the two articles by the Wall Street Journal as well as CNN. So starting out with the Wall Street Journal, there is a few points which says that military experts say that Ukraine will likely need more Leopard 2 tanks and other Western provided military equipment to advance through these defense lines. And huge losses of Western equipment forced the armed forces of Ukraine to change tactics. Now the counteroffensive is led by infantry, assembled from reserve units. The armed forces of Ukraine are trying to pass the minefields on foot, where they suffer huge losses. And then there's this by the CNN, quoting John Kirby in an interview. It's incremental and it's slow and it's not without its difficulties, but they keep trying. So generally the view on the counteroffensive is that the Ukrainian forces are unable to bring some proper success to the table, and that it is a very difficult task for them due to their limited amount of capabilities in comparison to the Russian forces and the Russian defenses built there. So the Ukrainians need a lot more weaponry and a lot more forces if they want to break through the Russian lines. And the West is seeing that based on their communication with Ukraine as well as what is happening on the front. And here comes in my clarification with the 31 Abrams tanks. When I said that the Ukrainians have a possibility of breaking through the first line of defense, I didn't mean with 31 Abrams tanks alone. I mean with whatever they have left of Leopard 2 tanks, the 12 Challenger 2 tanks, the 31 Abrams tanks, and the hundreds of Leopard 1 tanks being sent, combined with the hundreds of Soviet tanks they have left, that could possibly bring the number up to multiple hundreds of tanks. And if they concentrate that in an offensive, then they're able to at the very least threaten a breakthrough. So the Russians are definitely not sleeping and relaxing now, because the main push is yet to come. But as I've said, until the Russian forces lose Robotyne, the main push will not happen, as the Ukrainians will not risk going for the first line of defense without having a secure flank when going forward. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.